Hey, we're talking about England.
I'm always just picking on you.
That's what rollers do.
We're excited to have Ben Timmy, how you pronounce your last name?
Hoksberger.
Hoksberger.
That's why I called you Ben.
That works. I'll answer to Ben.
Ben Hoksberger, and he's a professional archaeologist. Used to work for the Redstone Arsenal on the Army base, but I think you got a job at NASA now, don't you? And you teach some at UAH. And I've just met him a few minutes, talked to him on the phone. He seems really kind. Randy Boyette, you know that name? Randy told me he was a great person to work for, and I had to work for Randy many years, and Randy was an awful person to work for. So you gotta be a pretty decent guy. And but I was doing some research on this fight at Indian Creek Ford because of some work I'm doing around Hood's campaign, and I did a search because I'd gotten all this material together, and I was ready to write a whole 9 or 10 page thing on this battle, and this guy had already written it. I didn't even have to do it, so I said, this would be a great guy to have over here because the archaeological stuff is fascinating too. So I'm not going to make any more comments. I'm going to let Ben take it away.
Hey, Ben, I'm going to turn this spotlight out and be ready for you.
All right, sounds good. Well, thanks for having me. I'm professional archaeologist, like Greg said, more of an archaeologist than a historian, so you have to bear with me for some of this. But this is a project I did several years back, so it's not terribly fresh in my memory either. So we'll see how well I do here. We'll try to set the stage just a little bit. If you're a Civil War buff here in Western Theater, you can probably recite this story in your sleep. But it goes back to late in the year 1864. Sherman had just pushed Hood out of Atlanta and was starting to gear up for his march to the sea. Hood moved to the west and north towards Chattanooga, trying to disrupt Sherman's supply lines, sabotaging the railroad and picking away at the garrisons along the railroad there up towards Dalton. And then he doubled back and regrouped in Gadsden for a while and kind of reevaluated the theater and tried to come up with a plan for what to do next. And he decided to move westward across North Alabama. First aimed for Guntersville, hoping to cross the river there and maybe move up into central Tennessee, hoping to confront General Thomas up there, his army, and then perhaps eventually moving into Kentucky, rallying some more recruits there, and then moving eastward to relieve Lee. So he set off across North Alabama. Guntersville was a little too well fortified, had too many Union patrols and to get his army across the pontoon bridge there. So next he tried Decatur, and we're all probably familiar with that battle. It was well fortified, and he decided it was too tough a nut to crack, moved down the railroad towards Cortland, and eventually crossed it to Scumbia right here. So from there, Forrest kind of covered him northward through Tennessee, and as we know, he was weakened in Murfreesboro, ill-advised frontal assault there, weakened his troops, and he was eventually repulsed at Nashville, at the Battle of Nashville, and began his retreat back south. So where my story picks up, the Huntsville was still occupied by Union forces until November, and then with Hood crossing the river, they beat a hasty retreat up the railroad to Stevenson to avoid being outflanked by Hood. So in late December, the Union forces started moving back down from Stevenson down the railroad and made it as far as Huntsville on December the 22nd. That's where this adventure begins. So force, a Confederate force under Colonel John R. Burtwell, was garrisoned at Mooresville, and they received orders to move towards Huntsville on December 20th to just kind of assess the situation and await reinforcements. They were planning to occupy Huntsville and hold it for the Confederates until reinforcements arrived. But as they're going to Huntsville, they met a couple companies of pickets that had been stationed at Paint Rock Bridge up the railroad from Huntsville that had already had an engagement with U.S. forces moving down the railroad and got pushed back to Huntsville. So they absorbed those companies and moved back to Mooresville to kind of assess the situation and wait for further orders. The next day, or on the morning of December 22nd, around 150 men under Burtwell advanced to a position on Indian Creek, 6 miles west of Huntsville, and they kind of dug in there and waited for reinforcements. They were hoping Forrest would send some troops to come bail them out and hopefully thwart further advancement of the Union that was trying to rush back westward to cut off Hood's retreat. So the officers under Burtwell set up command in a little log cabin in the bluffs west Indian Creek. Well, the enlisted men camped about 200 yards away on the floodplain. And Burtwell, the next afternoon, ordered his troops to pile fence rails on all the railroad bridges between Huntsville and Decatur, hoping to be able to burn those before the Union could use them to get westward. And meanwhile, they heard cannonading to the rear because the Union gunboats had moved down as far as Decatur and were starting to bombard Confederate or suspected Confederate positions along the river there. So they were a little unsettled. They were already hearing rumors of Hood's defeat and retreat. They were hearing this cannon fire in their rear, so they kind of settled in for the night, uneasy and wondering what would happen. Still hadn't heard word of reinforcements, so everyone was kind of on edge. And that may have led to some frustration and some abuse of young man that was enslaved at that cabin, because that night he got fed up because of the ill treatment and snuck out and actually made his way down the road all the way to Huntsville, where he ran into Union patrols and reported the position of the Confederate force at Indian Creek. So the Union force under Colonel W.F. Prosser, he pulled together around 200 cavalry and began mobilizing to confront this force in Indian Creek. So they set out at night and rode double time and made it to Indian Creek by morning, just before daylight. And Burtwell had gone down to the Memphis and Charleston Railroad Bridge across Indian Creek just to check its condition and see if it had burned adequately. And just as he made it back, he heard gunfire on the road between there and Huntsville. Union movement had a confrontation at the Indian Creek ford and drove the Confederate forces back westward. So the Union troops pushed the Confederate pickets ahead of them. They ran into pickets and patrols between there and Huntsville, pushed these guys ahead of them, and there was some gunfire. That's what Burtwell heard when he was checking on the railroad bridge. And he came back, thought he had enough time, thought the pickets would hold the Union charge back for a little bit, assembled one line of defense about 25 paces away from the Indian Creek bank, and another line started assembling on the bluffs above Indian Creek. But before they could assemble, the Union attack swept down the steep slope of the Indian Creek bluffs and smashed right into the first line. They were able to get off one volley of shots before they got pushed back into the other line, and both lines fell into disarray and started retreating back towards Mooresville. So Burtwell and his lieutenants tried desperately trying to turn their force and get them to stand and fight, but by then the saber charge was too much for them, and they fled all the way back towards Mooresville. By the time the dust settled, the Union had chased them about as far as Mooresville before they turned back, and they captured around 50 men, and the rest of them were all able to limp back westward towards Decatur and onward. So it was mostly a saber charge, not a very consequential battle. Opened up the way for the Union to continue moving westward and try to cut off Hood's retreat, but that was eventually futile. But the reason I became interested in this little battle, back in 2000, 2001, I was involved with the archaeological survey of the Reflection Riding property that was part of the Battle Lookout Mountain battlefield. And we were kind of basing our methodology in that survey off the metal detector survey that the National Park Service did for the Battle of Little Bighorn. So we had a big team of metal detectorists, both professionals and just collector volunteers. And we swept the entire battlefield, and every time we got a hit, we would flag it. Usually we try to flag one color flag for iron objects and one color flag for non-ferrous objects. And then we'd come back and GPS each one of those and dig a certain percentage of each type and identify those artifacts and GPS that point really tightly so we could put it all into a GIS, and we'd have all our finds kind of mapped out on the landscape. And then we used historical sources, a whole array of archival sources to see how well that meshed with the archival documents and the history of the battle. And it was really neat. We were able to identify individual camps from both sides, and based on the artifacts, we could usually identify which side was camped there. We were able to identify fighting lines and directions of movement and everything. So I thought this is really neat, but I wonder how it would do for like smaller, more simple, more intimate types of engagements. So I always kind of had that in mind for this battlefield here, but I never really knew where it was. There was some dispute. Some of the Huntsville historians had always assumed it was one place, and others thought it was another place. And no one had really done a really in-depth analysis of the archival research or the archaeology to really figure out where this thing was. So my position at Redstone Arsenal was cultural resource manager and archaeologist, and that got me the opportunity to do a lot of field work on the arsenal, but in some cases the work would carry off to beyond the gates, and this was one of those situations. So if you've been out towards the arsenal on 565 lately, you've probably seen a lot of development on the north end of the arsenal. That is an enhanced use lease, the Army calls it. It's where they lease the land out to a private developer for 50 years or so, a fixed given amount of time. And then that developer is supposed to develop it, build up the infrastructure and buildings and everything. And then after the 50 years, that land reverts back to the Army. And they've got all these buildings and infrastructure there for their disposal. So the Army was planning on doing that in that red area there. It was about 450 acres of old pasture land and land the Army wasn't really using for anything other than agricultural leases. And so they were going to lease it out to this private developer to build up. And that developer had this whole master plan on what he wanted to do there, but that plan included a 10-story hotel. And since it was up against the north end of the arsenal, the view shed caused by that big modern hotel, looming on the skyline, could potentially affect the historic character of, National Register listed properties outside the gate. So there's one early plantation site, the Landford plantations on Indian Creek, about right there. So I kind of use that as the basis. It's listed on the National Register. It's a nice intact plantation site. And it was a concern that this big skyrise looming up above the trees in the yard might affect its historic character. So we increased our survey all the way out. I think it was a 1.5 mile radius around that whole development. So that pushed us up the Indian Creek corridor, up into the Huntsville's Research Park area, and UAH, and all that. We knew a lot of historic cemeteries and remains old plantations up in that area. So we went out and did a in-depth survey of that. It wasn't to the point where we shovel tested the entire thing and looked for all the archaeological sites, but we did pedestrian surveys looking at the National Register and looking at the ages of the buildings in that area. And so we did a pretty comprehensive architectural survey of that area. But I knew somewhere in that area, this battlefield had taken place. So I kind of made it my mission to try to locate it and document it. So one of the anchors for this battlefield was the old Memphis and Charleston Railroad Bridge. So we knew right where that was. You know, we can look at the old maps and figure out that the alignment of the railroad back in the 1860s was about the same as what it is now. And in fact, when I went to that bridge, one side still had the nice old stone masonry abutment. It was no longer in use. The actual railroad deck was had a space between it and the abutment, but looks like part of the 19th century structure was still there. In one of the accounts of this battle, there was a diary by the assistant of Burtwell that talked about their camp being located around a quarter mile away from this bridge. So that was my first clue. There's the bridge, and in GIS I drew a quarter mile radius around that bridge and looked for anything that might be undeveloped and intact to focus my survey on. And pretty much the only area where these little parcels, this is the Madison Academy. It's a private school, and they had a few parcels on their property that looked like they'd never been disturbed. So I had some help from Alexander Archaeological consultants out of Chattanooga. They were the same folks that did the Lookout Mountain Battlefield survey. They came out with their metal detectors, and I had mine, and we began doing transects across these parcels, just spacing out, doing a metal detector sweep, using the same methodology, you know, flagging with different colors and digging a certain percentage. And we found old horseshoes, some old oil filters, shotgun shells, and a bunch of junk, but didn't find a single artifact that we could definitively say dated to the Civil War. So then I started looking at old maps and identifying where the roads may have been during the Civil War. And up here, that earlier map was overlay of the 1875 map. That was the earliest map with roads in this area that I could find. And it showed the old roadbed crossing Indian Creek right here, and then continuing on to Mooresville. So I figured in 1875, that was probably going to be approximately following whatever road was there in the 1860s. And Brian Hogan, some of you might have known him. He was a longtime Civil War historian over in Huntsville. I bounced a lot of this across him, and he's like, oh yeah, I've always thought the battle was right up here at this ford. So I consulted with him in the past before, knew he was a smart guy, and so I decided to go with that and check it out. So I found an intact area. This is a Korean church right here, and they had some land that butted up against Huntsville city land on the Indian Creek Greenway, and it was full of nice mature hardwoods, looked like it hadn't been disturbed at all, so I focused a lot of the survey there. And then I was able to get in over here on city land and do some survey on the bluff. And lo and behold, I hit pay dirt. So we found, this is a topographic map of that first survey area on the west side of that ford. And all these little points are historic metal artifacts, some of which were clearly Civil War era. So here's the ammunition we found. We got a Henry rifle casing.
Burnside.
Burnside bullet. Got some Merrill, there's the Burnside bullet taken out of the remains of the casing. Got some Merrill carbine bullets. What's that here? That's a Colt pistol bullet. We had some carved bullets, one of which was found on the east bank, where you'd expect a picket along the road, probably a Confederate picket had been parked there carving this little Sage pistol bullet here. There's a bullet that has been cut and drilled probably into some kind of toy or ornament. And then we had fired bullets embedded in the bluff, the western bluff face, probably some sort of carbine bullet based on the weight. Got pistol balls. We had a lot of camp concentrations of camp items, and this melted mini ball was in a hearth on one of those little camps. A lot of Civil War era accoutrements that were found in these camp concentrations, and I'll show you a map in a bit of where these little camp concentrations were. But we've got a Union eagle button that was found up on top of the bluff. There's a knapsack hook that's been kind of bent and pulled, rosette from probably a civilian bridle, bedroll, buckles, civilian spur, neat little hand rod, hoof pick.
The spurs were kind of nice.
Yeah, that spur was a fun find. I found that spur in the same concentration as this. This is a cut artillery sabot. It's a sheet of lead sabot that's been rolled out and cut. And right next to it was a puddle of lead. So they've been recycling that probably to cast bullets. This nice keychain of skeleton keys. And then that spur were all right next to each other with some tent stakes, some improvised tent stakes. Another concentration had this harmonica reed plate. One right next to that hearth that had the melted mini ball was this fork and knife, nice 3-tined fork, probably mid-19th century, and then this rat tail file. And interestingly, there was a concentration of horseshoes and equestrian items and a old trace chain from a harness, all kind of concentrated in a row, going from the Indian Creek ford up through a little saddle in the bluff. So this was probably marking that mid-19th century roadway where, you know, not all of these necessarily had to be associated with the battle, but they were just various horseshoes that had been thrown on this roadway as traffic passed through there. Some of them were probably, we got a couple that were probably burden machine made, and that was typically what the Union Army was using, these machine-made horseshoes that would come in, you know, lots of them would be manufactured up north and then come down in casks that when they'd have the opportunity, they'd reshod their horses. And these particular ones were really fresh looking. And what most likely happened when the Union forces reoccupied Huntsville, you know, they'd spent a month or more on the road, you know, going up the railroad and back down. So as soon as they got back into Huntsville, the cavalry were probably reshodding their horses, and they were probably using, you know, these machine-made horseshoes that would have been available at the farriers in Huntsville. And so some of these very likely fresh horseshoes may have been lost in the battle. This is a LiDAR hillshade model of the battlefield, and so I was able to bring this imagery into my GIS and plot all the little finds on it. There's that saddle I was talking about. So you can see the old roadbed, and then by the early 1900s, the old maps show the road cutting up through here. You can see that roadbed really well. But my concentration of horseshoes and equestrian items was right through here. You can see this little saddle in the bluffs. That's probably where the old roadbed was. And so the way I compared the archival documents to the layout that I found archaeologically, this was probably the roadbed that the Union charged down. They came charging down these steep bluffs, and here's about 25 paces off the riverbank where the first line of the Confederate force was assembled, and it was just kind of like a Highland charge, rushing down slope and smashing into this line with their sabers drawn. Here's this little concentration up here that I think was probably a Confederate picket, just a handful of items including that carved bullet. So that was probably poor picket was just sitting there making breakfast or whatever.
That's high elevation too, right?
It is, yep. That's the bluff top. So from this point, you can see down the road quite a ways.
Yeah.
Now, is there actually a road there now, or is it just?
It's a private drive. So you see this disturbance up here.
Uh-huh.
This is a modern house.
Okay.
So I think the city property is this is a property line about right here, and that modern homestead uses that as a driveway,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's just kind of a dirt road going down here.
Okay.
And once you get on this side, it kind of gets lost in the floodplain silts and privet
Ben,
thickets.
about how, I mean, at the bluff, it's obviously pretty deep, but up there next to the house, how deep is that roadbed?
I'd say from here down to the roadbed, 15 feet. It's a pretty deep cut.
You know, Ben, it's possible, I was talking to you about that Winston family settlement, it might have been a settlement up around there.
Yeah, it's possible. I haven't done that plantation that's up in the bluffs it was owned by the Slaughters and then the Lanfords. But I don't remember who the original land grantee was.
Is that plantation home still existing, or is this?
It is.
Still there?
It's existing. It's on the National Register.
Oh, that's what you said on the National Register, or one of them, you know.
And I just submitted it. It was listed last year in a Places of Peril that the Alabama Historical Commission puts out because the research part has been eyeing that land for 20 years, hoping to expand into it and plop a big
I'll talk to you later, I'll try
office
to
building.
see that if I can find it.
Yeah, it's a nice plantation. It's privately owned, still has most of the outbuildings. Some of the old tenant houses are still standing on.
Is it open materials, or it's just a private home?
It's just private,
Okay.
and they're really private people.
Yeah.
I know them, and they're really interested in preserving it and passing it on, and but they.
No,
they
I'd
don't
like
let
to
a
talk
lot
to them,
of
see if
people
they know anything about Winston Hinchy, but that's.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out for
That's another
that.
subject, though, yeah.
So once this is on a little bit farther west, the Union force pushed that first line of defense up into the bluffs, into the second line that was still in the process of forming. And several of the dropped bullets I found were on this line. So you can imagine, the Confederate force trying to load up their carbines and everything, and seeing this Union charge coming out with drawn sabers and funneling and dropping the bullets right there. I forget which one. Let's see. There's a Henry carbine or a Henry casing there. These are all camp items. The little triangles are camp items. So there's probably some higher ranking folks up on the bluff in a couple concentrations. Some of the lower ranking enlisted men down on floodplain here. I think that concentration with the I don't remember exactly where that. I think it was down here that I found that spur and the lead sprue and artillery salad and stuff.
So the skirmish was not along the roadbed, was it?
Well, I think at that time the roadbed went up over this saddle. So this is a saddle right here.
Yeah, okay.
And then it moved westward from there. So that knapsack hook that was bent, you can really imagine, a Confederate soldier reaching up and grabbing a Union knapsack and yanking at it while he's trying to defend himself. It's a pretty intimate scene when you get all these artifacts here. It was kind of an interesting accident of preservation.
Yeah, one of the Confederate officers that was killed there is actually buried in the cemetery over here.
Is it really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I probably knew that at one time.
Well, there's a two stories to it, but I think the Irving's diary clarifies it that he was actually killed in this battle. There's
Okay.
another story says he was killed because after he'd been because he was in the hospital at Madison Station, but I don't think that's accurate.
Okay.
And Irvin was from Florence.
That's right.
The house he lived in after the Civil War, the house he grew up in is still there.
Oh, that's cool. I'd like to see that. So Brian Hogan and I were able to look through the records and identify, I think it was around 61 Confederates that had fallen into Union custody on this day in the Huntsville area. Not necessarily all from this battle, but it tracks pretty closely to the estimates that the different eyewitnesses had, which range between, 49 and around 60 that were captured. We've got various interesting accounts. We've got Irvine's account on the Confederate side, but then we've got two eyewitness accounts of people engaged in the battle on the Union side. And then Lyon's account, who was the presiding officer in Huntsville at the time. Then Mary Chaddock's account, she was a civilian in Huntsville that had a well-known diary in the area, the Civil War diary, and she talks about seeing the Confederate prisoners being marched into Huntsville.
Between just to clarify, between Chaddock and Lyon, and maybe Irving too, but I don't remember. But they gave the impression that many of those Confederate soldiers were actually kids that just joined up right after they had pushed Union soldiers out of Huntsville.
I'm sure.
So I always thought that was interesting.
She said there's a lot of son, all the parents and loved ones started, trying to intercede on their behalf as soon as they got marched into Huntsville.
Yeah.
So a lot of them may have been freed, through the intercessions of family before they got shipped off to the prisons in the north, but a lot of them ended up, especially the officers, ended up in the prisons up north. Then there's references, a few oblique references in the official records and Confederate rolls and so forth. But for such a small, relatively insignificant battle, it was fairly well reported and had a lot of different perspectives. So that was kind of fun to see how it played out on the ground. So the battlefield itself, it was surprising with the level of artifact collecting that has gone on in the Huntsville area and all the development. This little battlefield survived, and I was really excited to locate it and document some of the history there. In fact, we found very little in the way of artifacts that post-dated the Civil War. Which tells me, most of what we found were just, paper shotgun shells from the, mid part, up to the mid part of the 20th century. So the area was probably used for hunting, and it was just kind of grew up when they rerouted the road. It just grew up in woods, and people just hunt the creek bluffs at that location. One of the only non-hunting items was this object here that we found right up on top of the bluff. Anybody know what that is?
Well,
Is that a settler's token?
Well, it is
It's a container.
a token of sorts. That is
I know what it is.
like 1920s era
It's condom pouch.
condom tin. Yep. So that hints at one other
Might say
activity
make
that
love,
may have
not
taken
war.
place on the site sometime in history. But
I had to think about it for a second. I haven't
Yeah.
seen one in 50-something years.
yep. And we found both sides to it laying side by side. So there's the bottom of it, and there's the cap.
that bottom of that cap says what, selected tested?
3 Merry Widows brand. Price $1.
$1.
So, here's a map. I think they put this out during the sesquicentennial Park Service map on, where the major battlefields were located. And these are the major battles, but for each of these major battles, there's probably hundreds of these little battles.
Yeah.
And, Park Service and the Battlefield Trust and different organizations have been doing a great job of, acquiring the land on these larger battlefields and preserving it and restoring it. But a lot of these little battles are just being lost to development, lost to, indiscriminate artifact collecting and things like that. So one of the things I've been trying to do, since these little battles are the lion's share of the engagements that we see in the Western Theater, especially in North Alabama, I've been trying to document these as much as possible. Other archaeologists, I know Scott's probably run into a few of these recorded over the years. We're trying to capture this data, and unfortunately a lot of it slips through the cracks with standard archaeological surveys that usually involve digging these post holes, digging these shovel tests, and screening the dirt. The artifacts are going to be much more diffuse than, say, like an Indian village or something. So shovel test surveys don't usually cut it. So I'm trying to get the word out to archaeologists that, do your historical research, see if there's any sort of Civil War activity in the area, and get your metal detectors out and try to locate these sites. I've had a few good volunteers over time in the artifact collecting, metal detecting community, report these sites to me so I can record them and document them. But I've had many more metal detectors that are like, no way, I'm going to tell you where my honey hole is, So a lot of these are disappearing fast, and I wanted to, throw out my contact information to everyone that if you know of these sites and are interested in helping me out, I'll be happy to help you document those and record them, preserve them for researchers in the future. So that's my little soapbox. A lot of folks helped me out with this project. Really grateful for historians like John Rankin and Brian Hogan that are actually good at researching history, or at least better than I am, that can point me in the right directions. Alexander Archaeological Consultants provided staff to help out with the survey, kind of on the company dime. And then Redstone actually let me get away from my desk and outside the gate a little bit to dig.
Most important was that bog one.
That's right. She's got a tough road to walk, that one.